talking about the food system, having a national conversation about the food system is critical for two reasons. First of all, we need to be understanding ourselves as a citizenry how the food system works, because if we don't, we can't change it. And I think this national conversation will vastly increase the understanding amongst our population about what is going wrong. But the second thing is that once we understand what's going wrong, the more people who understand that, the more pressure there will be on government to act. But also, the more people will start to act from the bottom up.
What does work? What does work to help bring about change? What did you bring forward into your work with the National Food Strategy from all of those multiple experiences about what works to get stuff to happen?
Well, I think that, so with the food strategy, I was actually trying to do two things. I was trying to describe how the system works, because as you know, most of the things that people believe about what we do, how it affects our environment and how it affects our bodies is just not true. And until people understand it, you're not going to get any change. And then the second piece was about policy, like what policies might change it. And probably, you know, over 50% of the work was talking to experts around the world, really getting under the bonnet, and then trying to think about talking to the best systems people, what is a way that we can describe this so that policymakers can understand it. And that's when we kind of landed upon describing the two feedback loops that were going wrong, which we call the junk food cycle and the invisibility of nature. And fundamentally, those being the things that you need to fix as a policymaker. And we can talk about that if you want. And then once you've done that, funny enough, the policies that you put in place, it's quite what policies you actually get over the line is quite driven by luck and what happens in the newspapers. And then if we're really honest, because it is a complex system, it is actually unknowable. You know, you could think, well, if I do this, it should react in that way, but you cannot know until you do it, because systems have odd ways of reacting to things. So for example, if you look at the sugar tax on sugary drinks, which took out 45,000 tons of sugar from sugary drinks every year in this country, there's emerging evidence that some of that sugar, the share of sugar, might have shifted to sweets and to other things. So our bodies just got the sugar somewhere else. And this makes it even more difficult, because politicians want to know the answer. And if the answer is, well, these things, we have to try these things first, and they may or may not work, and they may work very well, or they may not work at all, or they may even cause problems of their own, but they're the first things that we have to try, and then we'll need to try some other things, and then we'll need to try some other things. That is a very difficult message for a politician who wants to talk in three-word slogans to take on board.
Yeah. The way that we do policy, particularly in the UK, in neat little departmental silos, and also actually how we conduct research, where we get our evidence from. You know, we really value the kind of deep specialist research rather than the kind of system research, looking across, if you like, the horizontal relationship between different areas, where, you know, it's what goes on. Well, in the work that we've been doing recently, the work that goes on in DEFRA has big implications for what might happen in the levelling up department for levelling up housing and communities around land use or bays. Yeah. And that kind of complexity of policy making is, even though we all know it, it's quite hard to talk about in really practical terms, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there are two things. There's one is the way government is organised. It's not a cause of the problems in the food system, but it does make it much more difficult to solve. You gave an example, you know, if you're thinking about what should the uplands in Dartmoor near me look like, not only need to get DEFRA's policy right. You need to get planning because you need to allow more leisure businesses. You need nature and leisure to replace farming.
Yeah.
You need to get the energy policy right because you don't want to have solar panels on areas where there's potential for biodiversity, etc. And you know, another example's health. You know, banning advertising for children's junk food to children. You've got the Department for Health saying we need to do this, it's costing us too much. Then you've got the Department for Culture, Media and Sport who are being lobbied by ITV saying, oh no, we're not going to have any kids programs and this is going to be a disaster for the economy. And you've got the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs saying, oh, this is going to be very bad for food businesses. And that just, there's enough grit in the gears when politicians are already a bit worried, there's enough grit just to slow them down. What's interesting is this isn't a now large companies are so huge. Actually, you can look at what big tech and data companies are doing and see how they get over some of these problems. And most tech and data companies now are not created in silos, so they don't. You know, it used to be that you would have the data engineers, the software writers, the marketing department, those companies now work in squads, so they get people from all of those different things, and they say, right, you have to solve this problem. So they've completely changed the way they've set up because they've realized that they weren't moving fast enough if they had these silos. Harder to do when you have an elected cabinet and all that.
The current food system isn't working for everyone at the moment. We know that the consequences for diet-related ill health are dramatic, and that the way that food is produced at the moment in some places is really damaging climate and nature. And you knew this already. Was there anything in particular in the writing and the researching of the National Food Strategy that really stood out and shocked you this time?
So I think there are probably three things that I find just really kind of cemented the problems that we have. On the environmental side, it was the chart that we show that shows the weight of animals that we rear to eat. 80 billion animals a year that we slaughter that at any one time weigh 20 times as much as all of the land-dwelling vertebrates and birds, and twice as much as all the human beings on Earth. And I just thought that was quite a good way of just realizing, you know, and we're quite subtle about meat in the plan and in the book, but it's just like, but that was like, wow, okay, there's clearly something gone wrong there. And then the second thing I think was on the health side, when the fact that we spend 2.2 billion pounds a year every year on fruit and veg, and 3.9 billion pounds on confectionery, which was just one form of junk food. And then that really was the thing that made me realize that the food companies were stuck in this cycle as much as we were. They were addicted because of the profits to selling us stuff that we loved because of our evolved appetite, and that was killing us. So there was that number. And then the final thing, which I still can't really get my head around. Like I've traveled all the way around the UK doing this. I've been to lots of food banks. I've been to lots of kind of communities that are struggling to get by, but it's gone up now. But the fact that the latest figures were 23% of children in this country are now eligible for free school meals. And the cutoff for free school meals is £7,400 household income before benefits. So that means that a quarter of the children in this country live in households that earn less than £7,400 before benefits. And that is poverty at such an unimaginable scale when you just go down the street and you see what's going on. And obviously, we've talked about this before, so many of the problems are actually problems about poverty or inequality that in some way that play out in the food system in various different ways. So I think those three things, the extent to which the food system has come to dominate nature, the extent to which the food system the junk food dominates our diet, and quite how unequal we are as a society. And those three things, I think when you look at them, still have the power to shock and people, people going through this process with you may have been vaguely aware that, that not all was right in the food system. But I think when you look under the bonnet, you think, Christ, this is goodness, sorry, this is one of the, this is causing some of the biggest problems in Western society. I think that's quite shocking.
Yeah. And I think we should be shocked. We should be shocked because we are still the sixth biggest economy in the world. I know we're trying quite hard to shrink it at the moment, but we are still a wealthy country, and that order of poverty ought to shock us. So I'm glad you raised that, because I think we've both talked, haven't we, about the triple challenge: climate, nature, and health. But the equity challenge, that fourth leg of the stool, actually really matters, because so much of what we talk about is as a result of poverty, and poverty as a determinant of health, as a constrainer of choices, as a how it limits people's capacity to live the lives we want. And just quickly, incidentally, we published another report last week with Big Local and Local Trust and lots of other food bank charities, but also poverty charities. It's called Beyond Charitable Food Aid, and it just makes the case yet again that we have to find more dignified strategies for tackling these issues than we have at the moment. But the thing that always gets me in that work, every time we do this work with people in the poorest communities in the country, people have great ideas. They have brilliant ideas. I heard today at a conference people saying the trouble is people don't know how to cook, they don't know how to buy things, they're making the wrong choices, as if blaming victims of a deeply unequal society somehow helps. But in all of my experience, people in communities, in the poorest communities, know exactly what they need to do, and they know what they want to do. They just don't have the resources to do it. And I think facing into that as one of the biggest policy challenges of our time is long overdue. Having taken this big systems view and having created this brilliantly evocative picture of the way the food system is working currently, when you came to writing your recommendations, I remember you saying you were going to pick on 10, was it 10 or 12?
I think there are 14 in the end, but the idea was not
really
to do,
straightforward things, wasn't it? They were really straightforward.
Not to do anything easy, not to recommend anything easy. That was the idea. Straightforward, but not easy. Yeah,
but I remember you saying these were things that government ought to be able to do. They did. This was not a thing. We weren't asking governments to boil the ocean. We were saying, here are a list of achievable things, which lots of us convened around, didn't we? Lots of us came together to support that. Yeah.
So we did a lot of work with the recommendations. First of all, discussing them in focus groups with people representative of communities from out the country. We held sessions basically in the northeast, northwest, southeast, and southwest. We then, after those, ran a bunch of again online focus groups, and then we did quantitative research, and we chose to do that research. Intentionally, I raised some money outside of government to commission the person who was the election strategist for the Tory party to do it, so they couldn't think, this is just a stitch-up job. I really wanted someone who was going to be pretty robust, and these were things that we thought doable. And I said, do these numbers mean, if you went and was sitting in front of the Prime Minister and he said to you, can I do this and still be elected? Would you say yes? And they were like, yes, we would say yes.
Mm-hmm.
But it is, that is not enough. Politicians are buffeted all the time by events, by newspaper stories, by lobbyists, by people in their own party, and it is just, and even if you look, for example, at the changes that the government are putting through, and they're still going through, we should be proud as a country that we're the only country really with the only country in Europe with a view about how you might create an environmentally friendly farming system. Mm-hmm. And even that, when they're just keeping that on it's so difficult, the political job in terms of both getting the detail right and the vision right. And you and I have seen how every 3 months or so it all falls off the rails, and then they have to try and get it back on the rails. And it's a difficult job. I think the area where I am shocked about the lack of action is on health. And I think the reason for that is because health is an area where, we did our focus groups, and even quite interventionist things like a reformulation tax on salt and sugar were very popular policies. And there, I think the reason that government, they've done nothing, they've gone backwards, actually. They've kicked policy things they were going to do, like advertising bans into the long grass. And I think there that you've got an instinctive ideological reaction against engagement in the market, even though there is no such thing as a free market in any country. Every country regulates all its markets in order to stop them doing harm to citizens. So, but there is still that instinctive reaction against different regulation, changing regulation, introducing regulation. And then you just get, and then in the Conservative Party, you have a group of MPs who are particularly virulent about that, and they will get in the ear of number 10. And then you have lobbyists who will get in the ear of the politicians. And all of that, as I said before, you don't need to throw much grit in the wheels and the cogs of government to stop things happening. And I think that with health is a great shame. And I think also, Labour as well at the moment, they are making noises. They clearly are nervous about how this will play out in the red wall, even though, when Labour did smoking restrictions on inside, they were told this was going to be a disaster and they were going to lose lots of votes and everyone would be furious. They did it, nothing, no kickback at all. People actually used to come up to Blair apparently and say, thank you very much, our pub smells much nicer now. So I think with health, I worry that Labour are worried, and therefore on both sides, because of this, the kind of the new creation of red wall man and woman, that there is an undata driven nervousness about acting in this area.
Let's just pick out some specifics here, because perhaps not everybody listening will have read the full National Food Strategy and might not realise how no-brainer some of your recommendations were, like feeding healthy food to kids, not marketing food to kids, making sure kids have healthy food every day. Just rattle through a few of those so many people agreed with.
So the fundamentals on health were that you needed to rebalance the system. You needed to break the junk food cycle. You needed to make it less commercially attractive for companies to make things that made people sick. And then, given that we had this huge level of inequality, you needed to use some of that money to support diets of people in poverty. So we recommended that you have a reformulation tax on the salt and sugar sold processors. So the kind of thing you buy in huge barrels, not what you buy on the shelf to make a cake in the supermarket. And that would, the Institute for Fiscal Studies modeled it. They believed it would have a huge reduction in sugar, that that went into people's diets. You know, or actually on one case, more than the total number of additional calories per person we're eating to make us all obese as a country, and that it would raise £3 billion, and that it wouldn't put up the cost because it was reformulation. It wouldn't put up the cost particularly much. It would put up the cost of you know, a small chocolate bar from 23p to 25p or something. We'd then take that money, and some of it, about £1.5 billion, you would use to increase availability of preschool meals, because at the moment, as I said, it's only £7,400 cut off. It's too low. Increase the availability of holiday food and activity programs for those children during the holidays. The same for Healthy Start, which gives families vouchers for fruit and veg and milk for young children and pregnant women. And then do what we call the Community Eat Well program, which again is just people who are really struggling, supporting their diet with fruit and veg. There's evidence they've done a similar thing here in Hackney near me. I'm around the corner from where we first met. And giving relatively low-level vouchers to people to spend in markets. The number of children in those families eating 5 a day went from 7% to 64%. You know, so you could have a huge effect just taking some of that money and supporting diets. All of those things are wildly, and funny enough, the one that you mentioned, which is restricting advertising, we didn't recommend because it was already meant to be happening.
Yes.
Because Boris Johnson had said he was going to do it after he was sick, and then again it got kicked into the long grass. And so, and then you've got government looking at, okay, so we need to do something. What can we do? Well, we can restrict advertising. And at that point, you have people who will say, salt and sugar reformulation tax, for example. Yes, well, I could, which incidentally, the president of Danone, the first private company to break cover and say we need it.
Yeah.
But they will say, yes, well, I can see how it might work, but you know, ice cream, we can't see how you'd reformulate ice cream, so it would put up the price of ice cream, and that's a treat for, you know, people, and it would be quite difficult to change our factories, so that would, you know, that people might lose jobs, and could we just do something voluntary for a bit, you know? So you just get this. Or on advertising, you know, I was lobbied by ITV on advertising, and they said, well, you know, advertising doesn't really make people buy more stuff. It just moves their purchase from one company to another. Categorically just not true. And yes, I'd be very careful if I were them saying that out loud, because that's how they make their money. And then they'll say, yes, you know, and you won't have money for children's programs, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, and if you really sit down with the CEOs of those companies, I was talking to one the other day, said, what can I do? And I said, you could do a lot on the environment because it's not as threatening to you commercially, but you've got all these factories making junk. There's very little I think you could do individually on this kind of food without getting fired, because you can't just tell your board you're not going to make this stuff. And you need government intervention. He was like, okay, fine. And then the next Wednesday, Nestle introduced a Kit Kat cereal saying it was tasty and nutritious, and it had a star on it. Yeah, well, I wrote to him and I said, look, your sector, you know, I said you couldn't do anything, but look what your sector is doing. You know, you could, at the very minimum, you could not be actively wicked. You know, I think that is, but funny enough, you know, and again, this shows you how the system works. The former CEO of one of the supermarkets texted me, and he said, because he saw the tweet, I think, and he said, Henry, go and look at the website of Nestle. Their mission is to be the #1 provider of nutritious food to the planet. And so they probably literally have a checkbox for product release, and it says, is it nutritious? And so it had to be nutritious for it to pass that checkbox. That's why that's gone on their thing. And then he said, look at the portion size. The portion size is 30 grams. No one's ever poured a bowl of cereal with a 30-gram portion. You know, when we tested it, it was between 50 and 80 grams. All the other Nestle cereals are 40 grams. And so you kind of got people who are stuck who know, looking at their children, and like, who know they're not doing the right thing, but kind of they are kind of stuck in the system and they can't get out. It's quite, people say I'm absurdly generous to them, but I think it's quite sad in a way. It's very difficult. Like, those people didn't come into these businesses realizing what they know now, and that's why they built their life, and now they can't get out of it.
We've been doing this work for a long time, and sometimes you kind of come to terms with the fact that it's not necessarily the big glossy stuff that causes change to happen, but it's just that really kind of unsexy, boring, but really persistent sticking with it that finally gets us to a tipping point. So where do you see those promising tipping points starting to emerge, or are we really quite stuck?
No, I mean, the system is unsustainable, which literally means it cannot carry on in this mode of operation. I think we've seen an extraordinary thing happen over the last 10 years with climate, which is beginning to happen with biodiversity now, which is it being taken really seriously. And I think we've already reached tipping points in things like electric cars. If you look at where the money is being invested, I just don't think I think it's unlikely that that the government will miss its 2030 electric car targets, because there's just so much money going into that. And so I'm broadly positive on the environmental agenda. I think there are endless day-to-day knockbacks, and you look at the River Wye and you think, well, that's pretty grim, but I am optimistic. I think on health and the idea of public health, so the idea at the moment people are talking about quite a lot about prevention, but really it's early diagnosis using data and early treatment, so that you nip the problem in the bud before it gets too bad. It costs less and it makes the person happier, and that's important. But I do think that it is now clearly so bad economically and in terms of the health service that we are quite close to a tipping point in terms of societal understanding. And I think once that happens, it's very hard to put that genie back in the box.
I mean, we hear a lot about what consumers want, don't we? And we hear that narrative over and over again with either newspapers or governments or in businesses telling us they know what consumers want, and they tell us they want cheap food and they don't want a nanny state and they don't really care about climate and nature in a cost of living crisis. Now, we talk to citizens a lot. You talk to citizens for the National Food Strategy work. What did you learn really specifically about what they want, and what do you think we might be about to hear from them now as we go out and ask people all around the UK, what do we really want from food?
Well, it'd be very interesting to see if it's changed. So I think there were two things. On the health side, people are clearly fed up. They want government to intervene. Like the majority of people realize what the big food companies are doing to our food environments, advertising to our children. They want the government to step in. On the environmental and biodiversity side, most people just, because that is much harder to understand viscerally. Most of us live in cities. Most of us look at monocultures in large fields and think that's the patchwork nature of the British countryside. I think people just want the government to sort it out. In the abstract, I think that, fun enough, clean water and rivers is the one exception where it's really cut through to the public consciousness. But mostly, I think when it comes to biodiversity collapse and carbon, we found that people did not feel they had the time or aptitude to be able to make those decisions in the supermarket, and that they just wanted government to make sure the food they ate wasn't reared in ways that was, the animals weren't reared cruelly, and the other food, all the food was reared in sustainable ways. And it'll be interesting to see if that's moved on.
Yeah. So the election's coming. It's definitely within the next year, if not sooner. Do you think this presents us any particular opportunities? And what would you be advising now for the most effective ways to engage with each of the parties in an incoming government to really kind of accelerate the actions that we've been talking about today?
So any citizen, I think the latest will be is December, isn't it, for 2004. Any citizen, if they want to affect policy. So I think that, you know, we need two things to happen. These feedback loops need government to break them. Government intervention is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so as a citizen, you can try and lobby for policy, and actually just writing to your MP. Anecdotally, the number is 6. If you get 6 MPs written emails written differently by different people, MPs think, oh my God, my constituents care about this. That is still a useful way of using your democratic responsibility. And so, you know, you can help get that top-down piece into place. The other thing is, we say in the book that, you know, we like to think we have free will, but we're trapped in this system. We're all cogs in this huge machine. But because we are cogs in this machine, you can actually turn it. And the other thing to do is just look at the very local community around you, you know, where you work, what you do outside work, at your home, and just do something small to make it a bit better. Eat a bit less meat in your house. Go into your child's school and have asked to eat their school meal with them. It's tremendously fun, and it's often can be game changing. Go to the local food bank, cook alongside your godchild or your grandchild or your child. You know, so I think that we need both top down and bottom up action.